In the scorching desert of 3rd century Syria, a young woman watched Roman legions march past her father's trading post. She never imagined she would one day command armies that would make those same legions tremble. Her name was Zenobia, and her journey from merchant's daughter to empress would reshape the ancient Mediterranean world. First, we'll discover how a multilingual child of the trade routes absorbed lessons of power, from Greek tutors and desert caravans alike. Next, her transformation from grieving widow to conquering queen, as she seized control of Egypt and challenged Rome's monopoly on imperial authority. Then, we witness the grinding weight of war, as Emperor Aurelian's methodical brilliance slowly dismantled everything she had built. And finally, we follow her transformation from defeated empress to dignified exile, watching as her children embrace the Roman world she had fought to resist. Tonight, we trace the footsteps of the woman who dared to dream of an Eastern empire, whose ambition burned so brightly that its light still illuminates the pages of history 17 centuries later. In the scorching heat of a Syrian summer, young Zenobia pressed her face against the cool marble columns of her father's trading house. She watched as another caravan emerged from the desert haze. The bells on the camels' necks created a symphony, the soundtrack of her childhood. Each chime represented another thread in the vast web of commerce that made Palmyra the jewel of the eastern trade routes. Born around 240 CE into the merchant aristocracy of this desert metropolis, she inhabited a world where Roman eagles, Persian lions, and Arabian horses all gathered at the same watering holes. This intoxicating blend of cultures would shape her extraordinary destiny. Her father, Julius Aurelius Zenobius, commanded respect not through military might, but through the subtle power of controlling what empires needed most desperately. His caravans carried Chinese silk that would grace Roman senators' wives, Indian spices that would season Persian feasts, and Arabian incense that would burn in Egyptian temples. As she accompanied him through the bustling markets, she learned to judge the quality of jade by touch, and the purity of frankincense by scent. Young Zenobia absorbed a fundamental truth that would guide her future conquests. True power lay not in the sword alone, but in controlling the arteries through which the lifeblood of civilization flowed. The education her father provided went far beyond the practical matters of trade. In the cool shade of their villa's courtyard, surrounded by fountains that whispered of distant rivers, she sat with tutors who had traveled from Athens and Alexandria to teach in prosperous Palmyra. The child, who could already speak Aramaic and Arabic, soon added Greek and Latin to her repertoire. Then Egyptian and Hebrew. Each language opened new worlds of thought and possibility. Her favorite tutor, an elderly Greek scholar named Cassius Longinus, would spend hours reciting Homer's tales, tales of heroes who bent fate to their will, of Odysseus whose cleverness conquered where strength alone would fail. She absorbed Virgil's Aeneid with particular fascination, drawn to the story of a leader who built a new empire from the ashes of the old. But it was the history lessons that truly captured her imagination. While other young women of her class learned to manage households and please husbands, Zenobia demanded to know how Alexander had conquered the known world before his 30th birthday, how Hannibal had brought Rome to its knees with elephants and audacity, how Cleopatra had wielded her intelligence and charm to command the loyalty of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She would lie awake at night in her silk-draped bed, imagining herself not as a merchant's daughter, but as a queen who would one day make the world tremble at her name. Her marriage to Septimius Odaenathus, arranged when she was barely 17, thrust her from the world of dreams into the harsh reality of power. Odaenathus ruled Palmyra as a client king under Roman authority, a position that required him to perform an endless dance of submission and subtle resistance. She watched from behind ornate screens as he received Roman envoys who spoke honeyed words, while their eyes calculated how much wealth they could extract. She observed as Persian ambassadors whispered promises of support. If only Palmyra would abandon its Roman allegiance. She listened as tribal chieftains demanded respect for ancient customs, while Roman law sought to reshape their world in its own image. The early years of their marriage taught her that survival in this world required not just intelligence, but an almost supernatural ability to read the shifting currents of loyalty and betrayal. Odaenathus would return from his council meetings exhausted. She would massage his temples while he explained the delicate negotiations that kept Palmyra balanced on the knife's edge between East and West. He spoke of how a misplaced word to a Roman governor could bring legions to their gates, how a perceived slight to a Bedouin sheikh could close vital trade routes, how the Persian king watched from across the Euphrates, like a patient spider waiting for any sign of weakness. The birth of their first son, Herenianus, brought a new dimension to her understanding of power. As she held the squirming infant, feeling his tiny fingers grip hers with surprising strength, she experienced a fierce protective instinct that went beyond personal ambition. This child represented not just the continuation of their bloodline, but the future of Palmyra itself. When Vabalithus followed 2 years later, she felt the weight of dynasty settling upon her shoulders. These boys would need an empire worthy of their heritage, a legacy that would protect them from the fate that befell so many princes in this violent age. The 260s brought chaos that would reshape the entire Roman world and create the opportunities Zenobia had been unconsciously preparing for her entire life. Emperor Valerian's catastrophic defeat and capture by the Persians sent shockwaves through the empire. She stood on the palace walls with Odaenathus, watching refugees stream in from the west. Their faces bore the hollow look of those who had seen the impossible, Roman legions scattered like dust before Persian cavalry. The stories they told spoke of cities burning, of ancient temples desecrated, of an order that had seemed eternal crumbling in mere months. Odaenathus rose to this challenge with a vigor that impressed even his ambitious wife. She watched him transform from a careful client king into a military commander of genuine brilliance. He gathered the scattered Roman forces, combined them with Palmyrene troops hardened by years of desert warfare, and struck back at the Persians with devastating effectiveness. Zenobia accompanied him on several campaigns, not as a mere ornamental presence, but as an active participant in strategy sessions. She learned to read terrain maps by flickering lamplight, to calculate how many days an army could march on limited water supplies, to understand the psychology of soldiers who needed to believe in their cause as much as their commander. The intellectual life she cultivated back in Palmyra during these years of warfare became legendary throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Her palace salons attracted philosophers, poets, historians, and theologians from across the known world. They would gather in rooms scented with jasmine and myrrh, debating late into the night about the nature of legitimate rule, the relationship between power and justice, the qualities that separated tyrants from true leaders. She participated in these discussions not as a passive hostess, but as an intellectual equal. Her arguments were sharpened by years of study and practical experience. Her obsession with Cleopatra during this period became something approaching religious devotion. She collected every account of the Egyptian queen's life, from Roman propaganda to Egyptian temple inscriptions. She traced Cleopatra's bloodline, studied her education, analyzed her political alliances with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign. But where others saw only Cleopatra's tragic end, Zenobia focused on the decades of successful rule, the economic prosperity Egypt enjoyed under her reign, the cultural renaissance she fostered. Most importantly, she studied Cleopatra's mistakes, the over-reliance on Roman protectors, the failure to build indigenous military strength, the fatal decision to stake everything on a single naval battle at Actium. The assassination of Odaenathus in 267 CE came with the sudden violence of a desert storm. Whether his nephew Maeonius acted from personal ambition or as an agent of larger forces remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. Zenobia discovered her husband's body in his tent. Multiple dagger wounds testified to the fury of the attack. She allowed herself precisely 1 hour of private grief before emerging to take control of a situation that could have dissolved into chaos. Her swift action in securing the loyalty of the army and executing the conspirators demonstrated a ruthlessness that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. Standing beside Odenathus's funeral pyre as the sun set over the desert, watching the flames consume the man who had been her partner in power, if not in love. Zenobia felt the constraints of her previous life burning away with him. The smoke that rose into the darkening sky carried with it her role as supportive wife and careful student of power. What emerged from that transformative moment was something far more dangerous, a woman who understood that the chaos engulfing the Roman world had created a vacuum that demanded to be filled. As the last embers died and the stars emerged in the clear desert air, she made a silent vow to her young sons sleeping in the palace. They would inherit not just a city balanced precariously between empires, but an empire of their own, an empire that would make the world acknowledge a new sun rising in the east. Within months of becoming regent, Zenobia moved with the calculated precision of a master chess player, arranging pieces for an endgame only she could see. The palace halls that had once echoed with Odenathus's commanding voice now whispered with a different kind of power. She systematically identified and neutralized potential threats to her authority. Her approach combined the silk glove with the iron fist. Rival nobles found themselves offered positions of honor in distant provinces. They dared not refuse. Those who showed open defiance, they simply disappeared into the desert night, their fates becoming cautionary tales whispered in the bazaars. She distributed Palmyra's vast treasury with strategic generosity, ensuring that key military commanders and tribal leaders understood one thing: their prosperity depended entirely on her continued rule. The few who questioned a woman's right to power, they discovered that gender became irrelevant when that woman controlled both the purse strings and the loyalty of the palace guard. The transformation of Palmyra's traditional council meetings into theatrical displays of her authority revealed her genius for political performance. Where once elderly merchants had droned through trade agreements in stuffy chambers, Zenobia created spectacles of power that would have impressed even the Roman Senate. She would enter the great hall preceded by drummers. Their rhythms seemed to match the heartbeat of the assembled crowd. Her robes, a carefully chosen blend of Roman purple and Persian gold, caught the light from hundreds of oil lamps. When she spoke, her voice carried the musical cadence of her multilingual education. She switched effortlessly between Arabic to address the Bedouin chiefs, Greek for the educated elite, and Aramaic for the common merchants. Her arguments wove together practical economics with soaring rhetoric about Palmyra's destiny, painting visions of an Eastern empire that would eclipse even Rome's fading glory. Skeptical tribal leaders who had arrived planning to challenge her authority, they found themselves instead pledging their swords to her cause, swept away by the sheer force of her conviction and the undeniable logic of her vision. The young queen's strategic mind recognized a fundamental truth. In the chaos consuming the Roman Empire, Palmyra faced a stark choice: expansion or eventual absorption. The power vacuum created by Rome's weakness would not remain empty forever. If she did not fill it, someone else, perhaps the Persians, perhaps a resurgent Rome, certainly would. She chose expansion, but her approach differed radically from the crude conquests of previous warlords. Beginning with the systematic acquisition of neighboring Syrian cities, she deployed a sophisticated combination of economic pressure, diplomatic seduction, and only when necessary, military force. Her agents preceded her armies, spreading gold and promises among local elites. They identified those who might be turned and those who would need to be removed. By the time her forces arrived at a city's gates, the groundwork for surrender had often already been laid. Her first major military campaign against Damascus revealed tactical abilities that surprised even her own generals. Rather than waste lives and resources on a prolonged siege, she orchestrated an economic stranglehold that slowly tightened around the ancient city like a silk noose. Her forces didn't attack the walls. Instead, they seized control of every trade route, every water source, every supply line that kept Damascus alive. Meanwhile, her diplomats worked within the city, promising Damascus's merchant elite that submission to Palmyra would mean lower taxes than Rome demanded, and protection for their traditional trading privileges. When Damascus's gates finally opened, It was not to a conquering army, but to a liberator who understood that a city taken without bloodshed was worth 10 cities taken by storm. The Damascus model became her template for expansion: patience, pressure, and promise, combining to achieve what brute force alone could never accomplish. The recruitment of Zabdas as her primary military commander proved to be one of her most inspired decisions. A professional soldier who had risen through the ranks of Odenathus's army, Zabdas possessed both the tactical brilliance to win battles and the strategic vision to understand Zenobia's larger goals. Their partnership combined her political genius with his military expertise, creating a formidable team that would challenge the established order of the Mediterranean world. Zabdas transformed Palmyra's forces from a collection of tribal levies and merchant guards into a professional army that could match Roman discipline. Yet they retained the mobility and desert warfare skills that gave them crucial advantages. Under his training, Palmyrene cavalry learned to fight in the Roman style when needed, but could also dissolve into the desert like morning mist when strategic withdrawal served their purposes better. Egypt's vast wealth and crucial grain supplies had beckoned to ambitious rulers since the days of Alexander. Zenobia spent months preparing for what she knew would be her most audacious conquest. The province that fed Rome held symbolic importance far beyond its economic value. To control Egypt was to hold a knife to the empire's throat. Her agents infiltrated Alexandria's merchant guilds and administrative bureaus. They identified officials who resented Roman taxation and Egyptian aristocrats who dreamed of restored independence. She cultivated relationships with the powerful priesthoods who still commanded loyalty in the countryside, promising to restore ancient privileges that Roman governors had steadily eroded. The intelligence network she built provided detailed information about garrison strengths, supply depot locations, and most crucially, the growing discontent among Egypt's population with their distant Roman masters. The invasion of Egypt in 269 CE unfolded with the precision of a carefully rehearsed performance. While Zabdas led the main force down the coastal route, creating the appearance of a conventional invasion, smaller units had already infiltrated the Nile Delta, preparing the ground for what would follow. Her agents in Alexandria coordinated their efforts, ensuring that when Palmyrene forces approached, key defensive positions would be undermined by desertion or outright betrayal. The Roman garrison, already weakened by transfers to other troubled frontiers, found itself facing not just an external invasion, but an internal uprising. Cities along the Nile raised Palmyrene banners before her armies even arrived. Their leaders calculated that Zenobia's rising star offered better prospects than Rome's setting sun. The campaign that Roman military manuals suggested should take months, it was effectively over in weeks. Her entry into Alexandria was orchestrated as a masterpiece of political theater that would have made Cleopatra herself proud. Rather than arriving as a foreign conqueror imposing alien rule, Zenobia presented herself as a liberator, returning Egypt to its rightful place among the great powers. She entered the city not in a war chariot, but in a golden barge that deliberately evoked memories of the Ptolemaic queens. Yet she carefully included symbols that appealed to every element of Alexandria's diverse population. Her first public acts included restoring funding to the Great Library, reducing the tax burden on small merchants, and most symbolically, participating in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies that Roman governors had long disdained. The message was clear. Under her rule, Egypt would be not an exploited province, but a valued partner in a new Eastern empire. The establishment of her son Vabalithus as co-ruler created a veneer of dynastic legitimacy that complicated Rome's legal position. By maintaining the fiction that she ruled merely as regent for her son, who held titles technically granted by Rome, she created a constitutional gray area that made direct military response politically problematic. The boy, now entering adolescence, was carefully groomed to play his part in this elaborate performance. He appeared at state occasions wearing a calculated blend of Roman and Eastern regalia. His public statements, obviously written by his mother, carefully balanced respect for Roman tradition with assertion of Palmyrene independence. This arrangement allowed wavering allies to convince themselves they weren't really rebelling against Rome. merely supporting the legitimate heir of a Roman client king. Her conquest of most of Asia Minor brought her into increasingly direct conflict with Roman interests, but she moved with such speed and strategic brilliance that imperial forces found themselves constantly reacting to yesterday's developments. City after city fell to her expanding empire, some through military action, but many through the simple calculation that Zenobia's rising power offered better protection than Rome's declining presence. She understood that in an age of uncertainty, people craved stability above all, and she offered that stability, backed by an increasingly professional army and an economic system that provided more predictable governance than the chaos of competing Roman generals. Her forces moved like water finding its level, flowing into every vacuum Roman weakness created. The minting of coins bearing her image alongside traditional Roman symbols was a calculated provocation. It stopped just short of open rebellion, while asserting her equality with the emperor. These coins, distributed throughout her territories and beyond, showed her wearing the diadem of a Hellenistic monarch on one side, while maintaining Roman imagery on the reverse. The inscriptions evolved gradually, first acknowledging Roman authority, then placing her name alongside the emperor's, finally suggesting a partnership of equals rather than a relationship of vassal to master. Each new minting pushed the boundaries slightly further, testing Roman tolerance while building her independent legitimacy. The coins became powerful propaganda tools, circulating far beyond her official territories, spreading awareness of this new power rising in the east. Her cultivation of relationships with Germanic tribes threatening Rome's northern borders demonstrated a strategic vision that extended far beyond her immediate sphere. Understanding that Rome's greatest weakness lay in its impossibly long frontiers, she maintained correspondence with tribal leaders from the Danube to the Rhine. She shared intelligence about Roman troop movements and occasionally provided gold to support their raids. These actions, conducted through intermediaries to maintain plausible deniability, ensured that Rome could never concentrate its full strength against her. Every legion tied down fighting Germanic incursions was one that couldn't march east to challenge her growing empire. This strategy of indirect pressure became a hallmark of her foreign policy, using Rome's other enemies as unwitting allies in her grand design. The transformation of Palmyra from a prosperous trading city into a glittering capital rivaling Rome itself required resources on an unprecedented scale. The tribute flowing in from conquered territories funded massive construction projects that changed the city's skyline seemingly overnight. New temples rose alongside expanded markets, their architecture blending Roman engineering with Eastern aesthetics, creating something uniquely Palmyrene. The great colonnaded street was extended and adorned with statues celebrating both her victories and Palmyra's commercial might. Public baths rivaling those of Rome offered citizens luxury previously unimaginable in a desert city. New aqueducts brought water from distant springs to support the growing population. Yet this transformation came at a cost, measured not just in gold, but in the increasing resentment of territories forced to fund Palmyra's glory. Her court became a beacon for intellectuals, artists, and philosophers fleeing the chaos and persecution plaguing other parts of the empire. The salon she had cultivated as Odenathus's wife now expanded into a full-fledged cultural renaissance, legitimizing her political revolution through intellectual achievement. Greek philosophers debated with Jewish rabbis, while Persian magi compared notes with Egyptian priests, all under the protective umbrella of her patronage. This gathering of minds produced new syntheses of thought, blending Eastern mysticism with Greek rationalism in ways that would influence intellectual development for centuries. The poetry composed in her court celebrated not just her military victories, but her vision of a new world order where East and West met as equals rather than conqueror and conquered. This cultural flowering served practical purposes beyond mere prestige. Grateful intellectuals became eloquent propagandists for her cause throughout the Mediterranean world. The declaration of herself as Augusta and her son as Augustus in 271 CE crossed the final line from autonomous client to rival empress. This momentous decision, made after months of careful preparation and consultation with her advisors, transformed the constitutional fiction that had protected her into an open challenge to Roman authority. The ceremony itself was staged with all the grandeur Palmyra could muster. Representatives from across her empire gathered to witness this historic moment. She appeared in full imperial regalia, the purple that only Roman emperors were permitted to wear, while young Vibalitha stood beside her in matching robes that emphasized their joint rule. The proclamation was read in multiple languages to ensure every subject understood the significance. The East now had its own emperors, and the age of Roman monopoly on imperial authority had ended. Standing on her palace balcony overlooking an empire that stretched from the mountains of Turkey to the cataracts of Sudan, Zenobia had achieved what no woman since Cleopatra had dared attempt: true independence from Rome. The view from that height must have been intoxicating. Merchant caravans streaming through gates that led to territories under her control, armies drilling in the plains below wearing her insignia, ambassadors from distant lands waiting in her antechambers to pay their respects. She had built not just a rebel kingdom, but a functioning empire with its own administrative system, its own military traditions, its own cultural identity. The girl who had once pressed her face against cool marble columns to watch passing caravans now commanded an empire that controlled those very trade routes. Yet even in this moment of supreme triumph, she must have known that Rome, wounded and weakened though it was, would not accept this challenge indefinitely. The storm clouds gathering in the west carried the promise of a reckoning that would test every skill, every alliance, every reserve of strength she had built. The ascent to power was complete, but the burden of maintaining that power would prove to be an even greater test of her extraordinary abilities. The Roman expeditions that began probing her defenses in early 272 CE bore the unmistakable signature of a new kind of enemy, one whose methodical brilliance would prove far more dangerous than the disorganized responses she had previously faced. Emperor Aurelian, the son of a Danubian peasant, had risen through sheer military genius to claim the purple. He approached the problem of Zenobia's empire with the patient calculation of a master craftsman, dismantling a complex mechanism. His initial forays into her territories weren't meant to conquer, but to study. Each skirmish provided intelligence about Palmyrene tactics. Each retreat taught him more about her commander's tendencies. The reports reaching Zenobia's war councils painted an increasingly troubling picture: an adversary who seemed immune to the strategies that had served her so well against previous Roman forces. The economic foundations of her empire, already strained by rapid expansion, began to crack under the pressure of preparing for total war. The same merchants who had celebrated her early victories now grumbled as tax collectors arrived with ever-increasing demands. Their ledgers reflected the astronomical costs of maintaining armies across thousands of miles of frontier. In the great bazaars of Damascus and Antioch, whispers spread of caravans seized to supply troops, young men conscripted from workshops and fields, the golden age of prosperity giving way to the iron necessities of survival. Zenobia found herself trapped in the cruel mathematics of empire. Every denarius spent on soldiers was one not invested in the trade networks that generated wealth. Yet without those soldiers, there would be no empire left to generate anything at all. Her diplomatic missions to the Persian court returned with promises as ephemeral as desert mirages. The Sassanid king expressed sympathy for her cause, while carefully avoiding any commitments that might draw him into direct conflict with a resurgent Rome. The barbarian tribes she had cultivated proved equally unreliable allies. Their chiefs were happy to accept her gold, but unwilling to coordinate their raids in ways that might actually relieve pressure on her eastern frontiers. The isolation that accompanied supreme power became increasingly apparent. She sat in council chambers that had once buzzed with ambitious allies, but now echoed with the voices of a dwindling circle of loyalists. Even those who remained began to hedge their bets, their eyes darting nervously whenever messengers arrived with news from the western frontiers. The siege of Antioch through the winter of 272 to 273 CE became a grinding test of endurance. It revealed both the strengths and limitations of her military machine. Zabdas commanded the defense with his characteristic brilliance. He turned the ancient city into a death trap for Roman assault forces. Its walls bristled with artillery that rained destruction on anyone foolish enough to approach. But as weeks turned to months, the cruel arithmetic of siege warfare began to tell. Every successful defense consumed irreplaceable supplies. Every Roman assault repelled coast defenders who couldn't be replaced. Every day that passed saw civilian morale eroding, like sandstone in a desert wind. The hospitals filled with wounded soldiers and starving citizens. Zenobia walked among them, dispensing coins and encouragement that rang increasingly hollow against the reality of empty granaries. Her decision to personally lead a cavalry sortie against Roman siege lines revealed how far she had traveled from the calculating politician of her early reign. It was a desperate attempt to break the encirclement, clad in armor specially crafted for her slight frame. Mounted on an Arabian stallion that had been her husband's favorite, she charged into battle with a fury that surprised enemies and allies alike. The sight of their Empress wielding a sword alongside common soldiers inspired her troops to superhuman efforts. They temporarily drove back Roman forces, opening a supply corridor that brought precious weeks of relief. But the cost written in blood across her armor and the exhaustion etched on her face afterward showed the physical toll of trying to be simultaneously commander, symbol, and warrior. The relationship with her son Vabalithus, now approaching his 18th year, deteriorated as the young man began asserting his own vision for their embattled empire. Raised in the expectation of power but sheltered from its harsh realities, he advocated for accommodation with Rome. He argued in heated palace councils that negotiated submission might preserve more than doomed resistance. Their arguments, conducted in the private apartments that had once echoed with a mother's lullabies, now rang with bitter recriminations. Two generations collided over the price worth paying for honor versus survival. She saw in his willingness to compromise a betrayal of everything she had built. He saw in her intransigence a stubbornness that would destroy them all. The systematic reduction of her Egyptian territories unfolded with the inevitability of the Nile's annual floods. Aurelian's forces advanced methodically up the great river, isolating and reducing each stronghold in turn. The loss of Alexandria struck particularly hard, not just for its economic importance, but for its symbolic value as the jewel of her Eastern Empire. The reports from her commanders described not heroic last stands, but pragmatic surrenders. Egyptian officials calculated that Roman rule, however oppressive, offered more stability than continued allegiance to a failing Palmyrene cause. Each defection felt like a personal betrayal, but she understood the cold logic that drove them. Rats fleeing a sinking ship sought whatever floating debris might support them. Intelligence networks that had once been her greatest advantage now brought only variations on a theme of disaster. Aurelian's patient strategy revealed itself in its full brilliance. He wasn't simply reconquering territory. He was systematically dismantling the economic and political structures that made her empire possible. Roman gold flowed to her former allies. Roman promises of amnesty weakened the resolve of her supporters. Roman military might ground down her forces in a dozen small engagements that bled her armies without offering the decisive battle where her tactical genius might still turn the tide. She found herself fighting not just an enemy, but a system. The vast machinery of Roman administration slowly reasserted itself across territories she could no longer effectively control. The defection of Antioch's merchant princes demonstrated how quickly pragmatism could override gratitude when survival was at stake. These men had grown wealthy under her rule, proclaimed eternal loyalty in her palace halls. They opened the city's gates to Aurelian's forces in exchange for guarantees. Their trade privileges would be restored, their past support for Zenobia forgiven, their fortunes preserved under renewed Roman rule. The bitterness of this betrayal was compounded by its predictability. She had risen to power, understanding how self-interest governed human behavior. yet somehow expected that success would inspire a loyalty transcending such base calculations. The fall of Antioch meant more than losing a city. It meant acknowledging that the empire she had built rested on foundations of sand that shifted with every change in the wind. The retreat to Palmyra transformed her beloved city from a cosmopolitan capital into a fortress preparing for its final stand. The same streets where philosophers had debated and merchants haggled now rang with the sound of weapons being forged and walls being reinforced. The beautiful gardens were torn up to plant vegetables that might sustain the population through a siege. The decorative fountains repurposed to store precious water. The theaters converted into barracks for the soldiers streaming in from abandoned frontiers. She supervised these preparations with the same attention to detail that had once gone into planning palace banquets. But the transformation of her city into an armed camp felt like watching a beautiful woman scarring her own face to avoid unwanted attention. The weight of command pressed upon her with physical force during the sleepless nights. She paced palace corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The decisions that had once come easily now required agonizing deliberation. Should she strip the last garrisons from outlying cities to strengthen Palmyra's defenses, abandoning loyal supporters to Roman vengeance? Should she empty the treasury to hire mercenaries whose loyalty would last exactly as long as the gold? Or preserve resources for a siege that might last months? Each choice seemed to lead only to different varieties of defeat. The options narrowed like a tunnel that allowed no room to turn around. The crown that had once sat lightly on her brow now felt heavy enough to drive her to her knees. Her final war councils became exercises in barely controlled desperation. She and her remaining commanders explored strategies that grew progressively more detached from military reality. Plans were proposed to poison water sources, to inspire religious uprisings in Roman territories, to assassinate Aurelian himself through hired killers, each scheme more fantastic than the last. Zabdas, loyal to the end but too honest to offer false hope, presented casualty figures and supply calculations that painted a mathematical certainty of defeat. The other commanders, those who hadn't already slipped away in the night, offered increasingly wild proposals. They revealed their own panic more than any genuine strategic thinking. She listened to it all with the patience of someone who had already accepted the inevitable, but needed to exhaust every possibility before admitting it. The psychological transformation from triumphant empress to besieged rebel was written in every line of her face, every gesture of her increasingly thin hands. The woman who had once commanded with serene confidence now snapped at servants over trivial mistakes. She alternated between manic energy and crushing lethargy, found herself unable to eat while insisting others maintain their strength. The physician who had attended her since her youth warned that she was burning through her life force, like a lamp consuming the last of its oil. But she dismissed his concerns with bitter laughter. What use was preserving health for a future that might not exist? The empire she had built to protect her sons now threatened to become their tomb, and the irony cut deeper than any sword. Standing on Palmyra's highest tower as Aurelian's legions appeared on the horizon, their armor glinting in the desert sun like a metallic sea, she experienced a moment of terrible clarity about the trajectory of her life. The girl who had watched caravans with wonder, the young woman who had studied Cleopatra's victories and defeats, the widow who had seized power with both hands. All these versions of herself seemed to converge in this moment of supreme crisis. The empire that had seemed so permanent, so inevitable during the years of expansion, now revealed itself as ephemeral as a desert flower blooming briefly after rain. Yet even facing destruction, she felt no regret for the attempt. Only a bone-deep exhaustion, and the growing certainty that the time had come to consider not how to win, but how to lose with whatever dignity remained possible. The decision to attempt escape came not from cowardice, but from a final, desperate calculation. Her capture might serve her people better than her death. If she could reach Persian territory, perhaps she could negotiate from exile, preserve something of Palmyrene autonomy through diplomacy, rather than watching her city burn in a final apocalyptic battle. The plan required abandoning the city that had been her power's foundation, leaving behind supporters who had staked everything on her cause, fleeing like a thief in the night from the throne she had claimed in blazing noon. As she prepared for flight, gathering only the most essential possessions and trusted companions, she paused in the palace chamber where she had once received ambassadors from across the known world. The empty throne seemed to mock her with its silence, a monument to ambitions that had soared too high and fallen to earth like Icarus, leaving only melted wax and scattered feathers as evidence of the attempt to touch the sun. The golden chains that bound her wrists caught the Mediterranean sunlight as the ship approached the Italian coast, each glint a reminder of how far she had fallen from the heights of imperial power. The capture near the Euphrates had been almost anticlimactic, her small party overtaken by Roman cavalry before they could reach the Persian frontier, her last gambit for survival ending with the quiet click of manacles. Yet even in captivity, she maintained the bearing that had once commanded armies, her back straight despite exhaustion, her gaze fixed on the horizon where her empire had already begun dissolving like morning mist. The Roman officers assigned to guard her spoke in hushed tones, of a prisoner unlike any they had encountered, one who accepted food with regal grace and slept on rough ship planks as if they were silk cushions, transforming imprisonment itself into a kind of performance. The journey to Rome stretched over weeks that blurred together, a haze of coastal towns and curious crowds, each stop becoming a stage for the complex drama of victor and vanquished. Aurelian, riding alongside her convoy, seemed almost puzzled by his prisoner's composure, occasionally engaging her in conversations that revealed his genuine respect for the adversary who had nearly split his empire. She spoke to him not as captive to captor, but as one sovereign to another, discussing military tactics with the detachment of scholars analyzing ancient battles, her insights occasionally drawing reluctant nods from the man who had destroyed her. The strange intimacy of these exchanges, two people who understood power as few others could, created a bond that transcended their current roles, though both knew it could not alter her fate. Her entry into Rome for Aurelian's triumph was orchestrated as the climax of imperial theater. Yet the spectacle unfolded differently than anyone had intended. The crowds lining the sacred way had come expecting to mock a defeated Eastern queen, to validate their superiority over the exotic Empress who had dared challenge Roman authority. Instead, they fell silent as her chariot passed, struck by the dignity of the woman who walked in golden chains as if they were royal regalia. She had chosen her appearance carefully, hair arranged in the elaborate palmyrene style that proclaimed her origins, wearing purple silk that stopped just short of imperial prerogative, her jewelry selected to catch the light with every measured step. Contemporary accounts describe hardened veterans weeping at the sight, not from pity but from recognition of greatness brought low, while Roman matrons studied her with admiration and unease, seeing in her composed features a reflection of possibilities they had never dared imagine. The moment of clemency came in the Forum, where tradition dictated that conquered rulers meet their end. But Aurelian's announcement of her pardon sent ripples of surprise through the assembled Senate. His decision reflected multiple calculations: the political value of mercy, the precedent of sparing female rulers, the recognition that making a martyr of such a figure might inspire more resistance than her continued existence. But perhaps, in that moment, when their eyes met across the space that separated throne from chains, there was also an acknowledgement of her unique stature, a concession that some enemies transcended the usual categories of Roman justice. The villa in Tivoli that became her new home was no dungeon but a gilded cage, complete with gardens, libraries, and servants, a stage for the final act of a life that had always been about performance. The transformation from Empress to Roman exile required adjustments that would have broken a lesser spirit, but Zenobia adapted with the same strategic brilliance she had once applied to conquest. The villa became a salon where intellectuals gathered, drawn by her reputation and staying for the stimulating conversations that recalled her palace gatherings in Palmyra. She devoted herself to writing, producing memoirs that unfortunately survive only in fragments. Philosophical treatises that engaged with Platonic concepts of justice and power, and letters to scattered supporters that walked the careful line between nostalgia and acceptance. The woman who had once commanded armies now commanded only words, but she wielded them with the same precision, creating through literature the legacy that military defeat had denied her. The integration of her children into Roman society provided both comfort and a peculiar form of torture, watching them flourish in the world she had fought to resist. Vabalithus, granted citizenship and a modest career in imperial administration, became thoroughly Roman in manner and outlook, his Palmyrene heritage reduced to an interesting biographical detail mentioned at dinner parties. Her daughters married into respectable Roman families, their children growing up with no memory of desert cities or dreams of Eastern Empire. She watched this transformation with complex emotions, seeing their children succeed by embracing everything she had opposed, their happiness a daily reminder of her empire's ephemeral nature. Yet she never reproached them for their choices, understanding that survival often required adaptations that idealism could not afford. The news of Palmyra's destruction following a second rebellion reached her villa like word of a death in the family, though she had no part in the uprising that provoked Roman vengeance. The city that had been her power's foundation was systematically demolished, its great colonnaded streets broken up, its temples toppled, its population dispersed or enslaved. The rebels had invoked her name, claiming to act in the spirit of her resistance, but their failure only completed the destruction her capture had begun. She spent days in seclusion after receiving the news, emerging with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned that some losses cut too deep for tears. The physical city might be erased, but she understood that ideas and examples possessed a durability that stone could never match. Her influence on subsequent female rulers manifested in subtle ways that historians have only recently begun to trace, as queens and empresses across centuries found in her example both inspiration and warning. The Byzantine Empress Theodora would study accounts of Zenobia's rise when consolidating her own power, while medieval queens invoked her precedent when asserting authority in male-dominated courts. Even Isabella of Castile reportedly kept a translated fragment of Zenobia's writings among her personal papers, drawing courage from the words of a woman who had dared to claim imperial dignity. Yet this influence remained largely unspoken, transmitted through private letters and whispered conversations, as if acknowledging her example too openly might invite similar punishment. The romanticization of her story began almost immediately after her death. As historians and poets found in her narrative, the perfect combination of exotic allure and tragic grandeur. Each retelling added new embellishments, impossible beauty, supernatural wisdom, dramatic death scenes that contradicted the prosaic reality of her quiet end in Tivoli. Medieval chroniclers transformed her into a Christian martyr despite her probable paganism. Renaissance artists painted her as a classical goddess despite her historical specificity. Enlightenment philosophers made her a symbol of reason despite her mystical inclinations. This mythologization served various agendas, but ultimately obscured the complex reality of a woman who had been neither pure heroine nor simple villain, but a political actor of extraordinary capability operating within the constraints of her time. The lasting impact on Roman policy toward client kingdoms proved to be one of her most concrete legacies, as the empire learned from her example to maintain tighter control over ambitious local rulers. Future emperors would intervene more quickly when client kings showed signs of independent ambition. Memories of how rapidly Zenobia had transformed from loyal ally to existential threat, shaping imperial calculations for generations. The delicate balance between local autonomy and imperial oversight that had allowed her rise was recalibrated toward direct control, closing the window of opportunity she had so brilliantly exploited. In this sense, her very success ensured that no successor could follow her path, her achievement paradoxically preventing its repetition. Modern archaeological excavations at Palmyra have revealed the sophistication of the civilization she briefly ruled, validating her vision of cultural synthesis even as they underscore the tragedy of its destruction. The uncovered inscriptions speak of a cosmopolitan society where multiple languages and traditions coexisted, where Eastern mysticism and Western philosophy engaged in productive dialogue, where trade routes carried ideas as readily as goods. These findings suggest that her empire, however brief, represented a genuine alternative to the homogenizing force of Roman rule, a glimpse of what a truly multicultural ancient world might have achieved. The fact that such potential was crushed so thoroughly speaks to both the threat it posed and the loss its destruction represented. The continuing scholarly debates over her motivations reveal how her figure resists simple categorization, even after 17 centuries. Was she a patriotic defender of Palmyrene independence, a feminist icon avant la lettre, an ambitious opportunist, or simply a pragmatist responding to circumstances? Each generation of historians has found in her story validation for their own preoccupations, from 19th century nationalists who saw her as a symbol of resistance to empire, to modern scholars who analyze her through lenses of gender, power, and cultural identity. The very intensity of these debates testifies to her enduring relevance, her example continuing to provoke questions about leadership, legitimacy, and the prices paid for challenging established order. Her brief empire's rapid dissolution after her capture illuminated both the personal nature of her authority and the structural weaknesses inherent in her system. Without her charismatic presence, the careful balances she had maintained between competing interests collapsed. Former allies turned on each other, and the Roman reconquest proceeded with minimal resistance. This swift unraveling might seem to diminish her achievement, yet it actually underscores the remarkable nature of her success in holding together such disparate elements through sheer force of personality and political skill. The empire she built was less a sustainable institution than an extended expression of individual will. Impressive precisely because it depended so completely on one extraordinary person's ability to make the impossible temporarily real. The philosophical works she produced during her years of exile, known only through fragments and secondary references, apparently engaged with fundamental questions about the nature of power, the relationship between force and legitimacy, the role of women in governance, and the possibility of synthesizing diverse cultural traditions. Roman intellectuals who visited her villa reported conversations that ranged from Stoic ethics to Eastern mysticism, from practical statecraft to abstract metaphysics, all unified by her unique perspective as someone who had wielded supreme power and lost it. These lost works represent one of history's great intellectual tragedies, as they might have provided insights available nowhere else from a woman who had stood at the pinnacle of ancient world power. Her death, when it came sometime around 275 CE, was as quietly dignified as her exile had been, passing peacefully in the villa that had become her final kingdom. Roman records note it briefly, more concerned with the disposition of her property than the end of one of history's most remarkable lives. Her children arranged appropriate funeral rites that blended Roman custom with subtle Palmyrene elements, a final synthesis of the cultures she had sought to unite. The absence of drama in her ending might disappoint those who prefer their historical figures to exit in grand gestures, but there was something fitting about this quiet conclusion to a life that had burned so brightly. She had learned, perhaps, that there were different kinds of power, and that the ability to shape how one would be remembered might outlast any territorial conquest. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell with monotonous regularity, her example continued to resonate in unexpected places and ways. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom preserved accounts of her reign that Roman historians had neglected, adding Arabic perspectives that enriched the historical record. Byzantine chroniclers found in her story parallels to their own struggles between East and West, while Crusader knights passed through Palmyra's ruins, wondering at the queen who had defied Rome itself. Each culture that encountered her story adapted it to their own needs, finding in her narrative validation for their own struggles against overwhelming odds. The merchant's daughter who became an empress spoke across centuries to anyone who dared to dream beyond the boundaries of their birth. The ultimate measure of her legacy lies not in the territory she conquered or the years she ruled, but in the proof she provided that individuals of extraordinary vision could still reshape the ancient world through determination and courage. In an age when historical forces seemed to dwarf human agency, when the machinery of empire appeared unstoppable, she demonstrated that personal will could still alter the course of nations. Her failure was inevitable, given the disparities of power she challenged. But her attempt was magnificent in its audacity. She remains forever frozen at that moment of supreme possibility, when a woman from the edge of empire stood as equal to Rome itself, transforming through sheer force of ambition the boundaries of what was considered possible. In the end, Zenobia achieved the rarest form of immortality, not through permanent conquest, but through permanent inspiration. Her example echoing through history as proof that some dreams justify themselves simply by being dreamed with sufficient courage to make the world, however briefly, believe in their reality. The golden chains fell silent against stone as Zenobia took her final steps into the Roman villa. She understood that some prisons are built not of walls but of memories, and that the greatest empires sometimes exist only in the space between who we were and who we dared to become. Her story speaks across 17 centuries to remind us that even in the shadow of mighty empires, individuals of extraordinary vision and determination can still carve out their own destiny, however briefly that flame might burn against the darkness. The merchant's daughter who commanded armies, who spoke 7 languages and made emperors tremble, teaches us that power flows not from birthright alone, but from the confluence of preparation and opportunity. Her rise from those marble columns where she watched passing caravans to the throne where she directed the fate of nations demonstrates the complex interplay of personal ambition, historical circumstance, and that eternal human desire for independence that no empire, however mighty, can ever fully extinguish. Though her Eastern Empire lasted only 6 years, a heartbeat in the grand sweep of history, her example echoed through corridors of power for centuries to come. Byzantine empresses studied her strategies, medieval queens invoked her precedent, and even today, archaeologists uncovering Palmyra's ruins find evidence of the sophisticated civilization she briefly brought to full flower. She proved that the impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to accept the limitations others would impose, transforming through sheer force of will the boundaries of what her world considered achievable. The woman who chose chains over surrender, who maintained her dignity whether commanding from a throne or confined to a villa, understood a truth that transcends any particular age or empire. We are measured not by the permanence of our achievements, but by the courage to attempt what others dare not imagine. Her legacy lives on not in territorial maps or dynastic lines, but in that spark of inspiration that ignites whenever someone reads her story and thinks, if she could challenge the world's greatest empire, what excuse do I have for accepting less than my dreams demand? Rest well tonight, knowing that some dreams justify themselves simply by being dreamed with sufficient courage, that failure in pursuit of the extraordinary carries more honor than success in accepting the ordinary. Let Zenobia's example settle into your thoughts like desert sand cooling under starlight, a reminder that true legacy lies not in duration, but in the willingness to rise, to dare, to transform the possible through the alchemy of ambition and action. Tomorrow brings its own empires to challenge, its own boundaries to transcend. But tonight let her story carry you into peaceful sleep, where merchants' daughters still become empresses, and the impossible bows before the indomitable human spirit.